So my name is Lisa DeVetter. I'm an associate professor of horticulture, specializing in small fruits, those being raspberry, strawberry, and blueberry, which we'll talk about today. And I'm based at the Washington State University Northwestern Washington Research and Extension Center. And so you'll see here on this slide, I've got pictures of blueberries. These are all blueberries grown up here in the western part of Washington State. And you see the species name, Vaccinium corymbosum. So that's the species that we're primarily talking about. And I will talk more about species, what's grown nationally, what's grown and what grows best here in Washington. And I'll also highlight some cultivars for our region, as well as some general tips about production, really for the emphasis or for the use of a home gardener or small scale production. And so if you have questions, of course, this event is a good opportunity to ask those questions. If you have questions later on, you're welcome to email me. My email is here on this slide. You also can check out my website. My website has information that is publicly available. Sometimes I have more resources available as well, such as the resources I shared for this presentation, in particular, one about blueberry propagation, because I was asked to present on blueberry propagation. That could be a whole topic on its own with a lot of details. So I thought it was best to give you more of a detailed guide so that if you're interested, you have all of the details from professionals that do both hardwood and softwood propagation. So here's the website. Everything posted on there is free. And again, I'm happy to take questions. So I like to begin this by just reiterating what a lot of people tend to forget is that blueberry is one of our true native fruit crops. Many people associate apples as being one of our native fruit crops, but I'm imagining several of you know that apples are not native to the United States, they're native to Kazakhstan. Likewise, cherries. You know, I think of cherry pie as one of the most American type of desserts out there, but you know, if you wanted to be really patriotic and you wanted to eat native fruits, it would be blueberry and cranberry. And so what we're looking at here is the distribution of Vaccinium corymbosum. This is northern high bush blueberry, and you can see through the green highlighted area where this species is native to. And so we as scientists talk about blueberry as being members in genus Vaccinium. That's just a general grouping, and that includes not just blueberry, but it also includes cranberry. But there are other species beyond just what we grow, being Vaccinium corymbosum. That is the northern high bush blueberry, which is grown and is the mainstay of our fresh market and our processed industry, both here in the Northwest, but elsewhere in the world. But in addition to that, we have other interesting species that are important economically. We have the low bush blueberry, that's Vaccinium angustifolium. Those are the blueberries that are grown in Maine and Nova Scotia. They're often called wild blueberry, but they're really being grown in semi-managed stands in those areas. And as the name would imply, they're low statured, shorter than the high bush, so we call them a low bush. And they also are very similar to cranberry if you've ever seen cranberry growing. They're almost more like a vine crop. Now, if you are a breeder and you're interested in hybridizing a low bush and a high bush, you can do that. And what you would get is a half high blueberry. These are, as the name would imply, shorter than a high bush, but they are taller than a low bush. So these half highs are grown primarily in the Midwestern parts of the United States. I'm from Iowa originally. This is what we grew primarily in our backyard garden and some commercially. And part of that is because of their shorter stature, they would kind of get insulated in drifting snow, and that snow would provide some nice insulation and prevent them from some of the cold desiccating wind. So it was a nice adaptable species of blueberry for our region. And we can also grow them here in the Northwest. I don't necessarily recommend them because they tend to be lower yielding, and our high bush species have really good quality, can be grown here, and just tend to yield much more because they are bigger plants in general. Then if you are curious, we also have southern highbush blueberry. These are complex hybrids, which include species of Vaccinium darrowi and others. And those are really important in the southern parts of the United States where they are not adapted to the cold temperatures. And they're also what we call low chilling. They don't require as much cold to properly form their flowers. I would not recommend these for Washington State. They tend to bloom too early for us. And they tend to resultingly have issues with winter hardiness because they bloom early and they don't escape our cold springs that we can sometimes have. Interesting thing too, if you're curious about blueberry, the southern highbush tend to be evergreen, so they will retain their leaves for long periods of time, longer than 2 years. Whereas the others I've just mentioned, half high, low bush, and northern highbush, they're more deciduous, so they'll drop their leaves. And some of them, which you'll learn later on, or you might already know about, can have some really fabulous fall color, so it can have some nice ornamental value. And then last but not least, we have rabbit eye blueberry, Vaccinium virgatum, used to be Vaccinium ashii. These are interesting, so we can grow these in Northwest Washington. They tend to ripen later, so there can be some fruit quality problems associated with this because when we have fruit ripening, cool weather and rain, we can have issues with rot, and we can also have issues with the fruit quality developing because the cooler weather tends to accentuate the acids and make the fruit a lot tartar, and that sweetness tends to not develop fully. But they can be important in other areas. They also have something called stone cells, which pears have as well. And so they have a lot more of a grittier texture to them as well. But they can be grown in our area. They have potentially a role, according to some horticulturalists and small scale producers, for late season markets. And they're an interesting crop as well when we look at blueberry. And I forgot to mention too, again, I'm kind of a plant nerd. I hope I'm in good company when I talk about plant species and a little bit of these quote unquote nerdy things, but blueberries in the family Ericaceae. This is the heath family or the heather family. It also includes rhododendrons and azaleas. It includes, as I mentioned previously, cranberry, and some of the unifying characteristics about these plants botanically is that they are adapted to low pH soil conditions, and they also lack root hairs. Root hairs being structures that are emerging from the roots and are really important for nutrient and water absorption. And how blueberry overcomes that is through the formation of symbioses with fungi in the soil called ericoid mycorrhizae. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But it's really some interesting characteristics about these plants that we can grow in our backyard. So let's focus more on Vaccinium corymbosum, again, the northern highbush blueberry. It's a deciduous perennial shrub. It is very shallow rooted compared to many other perennial fruit crops where most of the roots are in the top 12 to 18 inches and they're very fine rooted. As I mentioned, they don't have root hairs, which is pretty unique in the plant world, particularly the fruit world, and they just form these really important relationships with fungi called mycorrhizae. Now this is crown forming, meaning that if you can look at this picture here of this nice Duke blueberry plant, they have kind of a compressed stem or a juncture here at the base of the soil where we have the roots emerging and then the canes that form that shoot and canopy portion of the plant. They're great for both fresh and processed production. In general, after you plant a plant, if it's about a 1 gallon container nursery plant, it takes about 6 to 8 years for that bush to size up and reach its full yield potential, as long as there's no limiting factors. They also can be very long-lived. Kind of some of the literature says 40 to 50 years, but I've certainly seen plantings where those fields are 70, 80 years, and they are still remaining highly productive. And then they are called high chill, meaning they need a long winter of cool but not freezing temperatures to properly form those flower buds. Western Washington is great for getting those chilling hours and chilling accumulation. So that's why they're so well adapted to this area. So now I'm going to kind of leave the botany behind for a little bit and tell you a little about the history of high bush blueberry, because I think it's a really interesting story and it helps us appreciate the crop a little bit more.
Okay. It said, can you explain the significance of crown forming?
Sure. So the significance of crown forming, let's go back. So this is important in the sense of if we're looking at pruning and managing it, we're kind of managing it so it has this nice, you know, almost like a trunk. It would be contrasted with something that we would call sucker forming, like a raspberry, where if you were to leave this central part where you see most of the shoot growth coming up, or these canes coming up, you'd actually see more canes coming up around several feet or inches away. Rabbit eye is actually what we call sucker forming, so it kind of has more of a spreading growth habit, whereas these crown forming plants, they are more like individual bushes. So they don't spread through those suckers that emerge vegetatively. So I hope that addressed the question. And if not, again, just feel free to interrupt me. Okay, so the domestication timeline. One thing I like to just point out, and I think is really interesting, is that blueberries have only been domesticated and grown commercially for just a little over 100 years, which is very different compared to a lot of our other commercial fruit crops like strawberry or apple. First, though, blueberry was used by Native Americans. It was harvested from the wild and made into you know, dried meat and preserved meat products like pemmican. Same thing was used for cranberry, and it was harvested fresh as well. And it was not only just used for flavoring and preservation, but it also had some medicinal value for Native Americans. It wasn't until 1893 where the daughter of a cranberry grower in New Jersey named Elizabeth White noticed these crops growing adjacent to her family cranberry farm and noticed their potential for agricultural crop. Prior to that, people were still picking them from the wild, just much like how you might be picking huckleberry from the wild and enjoyment. Almost kind of simultaneously, while Elizabeth White was exploring the potential of blueberry in New Jersey, Frederick Coville, who was a USDA botanist, also saw their potential and started trying to take them from the wild and breed them. He also did several experiments, which he published in this document, Experiments in Blueberry Culture, in 1910. And this was kind of the revolutionary document for blueberry culture, because he discovered what a lot of people had failed to discover when they tried growing blueberry in commercial production settings. He discovered that they are adapted to low pH or acidic soil conditions, so that if you wanted to grow them successfully, you needed to make sure that your soil was modified accordingly and it was acidic and not neutral or alkaline. And that really led us to start to cultivate blueberry. And then Elizabeth White, being kind of the literary farmer's daughter that she was and pioneer, she read this, she was excited by it, she reached out to Frederick Coville, and they started this collaboration, which, as you'll see later on, led to the first production of commercial blueberry in Whitesburg, New Jersey. And you can even go there after the pandemic has passed and visit Elizabeth's White Farm and learn about the history of blueberry culture. And it's really a nice story about women in science. And she was acknowledged and given an outstanding contribution to agriculture award, which is pretty early at the time if you're looking at history of women in science and the role that they've had. And then from there, the industry really grew. So you'll see from 42 to 62, seedlings were distributed and planted across 13 states. Later on in 1974, July became known by the USDA as National Blueberry Month. And then there was a little bit of quiet activity. But then right around the 1900s, there started to be research funded by the commissions and the Blueberry Council on the potential health benefits of blueberry. And that scientific research kind of grew and grew and grew, and it started to be published and it started to be harnessed by the commissions and the council for marketing campaigns and developing what is known now as kind of the health halo of blueberry. And that really helped expand the industry They were already a pretty user-friendly product, but just having that health halo and being some of the first crops, along with pomegranate, to really advertise for that was a very effective marketing strategy, and really helped get that product in the market and help people realize that they like blueberries, and become more of the common crop that it is today. So as of 2012, you could find blueberries in 4,000 products, from our daily consumable food that we eat to pet food and cosmetics. That number has just grown over time. We just adopted a dog, and I was surprised to find that there's still like blueberry treats that you can get for your canine friend. And then it was just in 2016, so not that far along, that we celebrated our 100th anniversary of high bush blueberry. So the takeaway is that this crop has only been around for just a few, from a commercial standpoint, for just over 100 years. So historically speaking, and compared to other fruit crops, it's a pretty new crop. And it's got a lot of wild germplasm still associated with it, compared to, say, an apple for that matter. So, and these are some of the pictures. So on the left, you can see this is Frederick Koval and Elizabeth White examining a blueberry plant in Whitespaw, New Jersey. This is what the first clamshells looked like. They were in these wooden, I shouldn't say clamshells, they're these pint boxes made of wood and this almost saran wrap material. And then Elizabeth White again. So if you can't tell, I kind of idolize Elizabeth White, and I hope you find her story interesting. So now let's look where we're at. Blueberries in Washington is a really big industry. We are a leading producer of northern high bush blueberry, and also just in general cultivated blueberry. 2019, which is where we have the most recent production statistics, our industry had grown to 16,700 pounds, and we had, 16,700 acres. And we had 163 million pounds that we had harvested. 70% of this goes on to the process market, and represents the process market at the national level, and 24% of this is the national production value. If you combine this with Oregon, Washington, Oregon alone is about 50% of the total fresh and processed market in the US. So it's a huge industry for our region. We also are leaders in organic production of high bush blueberry. These production statistics are a little dated for the organic industry, but they still hold true. We produce most of our organic blueberries in the Prosser area, so Benton County, South Central Washington, where there's a lot of other fruit crops grown, as well as hops and whatnot. And it's big both for fresh and processed market. And on average, we're anywhere from 42 to 50% total fresh volume with our organic crop in the state. And if any of you shop at Costco's, which we sometimes frequent as a family, if you were to buy the Kirkland whole blueberries that you see here, or the organic blueberries, it is very likely going to be a product that's grown in Washington by Washington farmers. There's just a few exceptions where you might see the fruit coming from British Columbia. And a lot of the growers in British Columbia actually have land or homes in Washington. So there's that border there, but it's kind of almost permeable when you look at blueberry. Okay, so that's just a little bit of overview about the industry, the history. Now I want to spend some time talking about cultivar selection. And you might be wondering what this picture is of. This is a picture of Draper blueberry. This is a high bush blueberry species that's very widely grown in Washington state and elsewhere. It's originally from Michigan, and it's been a problem for our industry, to be quite honest, because it was planted in very large acreages without fully knowing how well it was adapted to our region. And what we learned after the industry scaled up on this variety is that it has a predisposition for calcium disorders, which you can see with this browning coloration, similar to bitter pit or blossom end rot in tomato. So what we've learned from this variety, and why I wouldn't recommend Draper for a home gardener if you were to find it, is that it preferentially will allocate calcium to its leaves and not the fruit. And the reason this is a problem is that calcium moves with water in the plant, and it moves from the roots up through the body of the plant, and it to the leaves where we have those holes in the leaves, those stomata that are causing this water to move with the calcium diffused in there. And some of that calcium would go to fruit as well. However, Draper really does not partition out that calcium very much to fruit, and the fruit has a high calcium demand. And so this sets it up for this predisposition for calcium disorders. When we have cloudy conditions, we just have less transpiration or water movement in our plants, and therefore we have less calcium moving in our plants and subsequently less calcium to our fruit. And what the problem then manifests as is what you see here, but it also manifests as premature fruit drop because the fruit just decides to not develop these fruit, so it'll shed them right before coloring. And that can be anywhere up to a 50%, sometimes up to a 70% loss in crop under really extreme circumstances. So the message here is cultivar selection really matters. Some of you might wonder too, what do I mean by cultivar? And I emphasize this quite a bit. Cultivar is cultivated variety. It is different than a variety, which sometimes gets used synonymously, but variety, botanically speaking, is a natural variant of a species. It arises in nature through natural forces, whereas a cultivar, in contrast, comes through active breeding efforts. And so you'll see on this slide, I have cultivars of apple here, Honeycrisp, Golden Delicious, and Granny Smith. And we have the same thing with blueberry, as I'm sure many of you know from some of the discussions today and what I've heard previously with this group. But for those that maybe haven't thought too deeply about cultivar selection, some things to think about as you select a cultivar is that you want something that is adapted. So it has the cold hardiness, it ripens in the amount of growth degree days or heat that we have, and its chilling requirement. So that's why we grow the northern high bush, not the southern high bush, because that has a very low chilling requirement, which means that it's not adapted and it would bloom too early and have some issues with hardiness. We also want to make sure that our cultivars are adapted to soil conditions. So for this, is our soil heavy? Is it prone to retaining water because it doesn't drain well, or is it light? That's important for blueberry. Cultivars like Draper and Duke, they tend to do very poorly with heavy, wet soil conditions. So those are ones that if that's what you have for your field site or for your garden, then you want to avoid those cultivars to set yourself up for success. There's also variation in tolerance or resistance to pests and diseases. So if you're looking at organic or a low spray program, having that tolerance or resistance can be a good tool. The other one is pollination. So most of the high bush blueberry species do not require any type of additional pollen parent or cross-pollination. They will pollinate themselves. But if you were to look at, say, the rabbit eye blueberries that I mentioned earlier, those do require cross-pollinizers. So another reason I don't necessarily recommend them from a home gardener, because you have to make sure that you have compatible plants to be able to get good fruit formation. And then some of the other characteristics to think about is suitability for maturity and harvest date. So is it maturing at the time where you would be able to pick your crop, or does it have the harvest season that you want? Some people want to be harvesting from June all the way to September, and you can do that with good cultivar selection. Some people just want a single crop. So those are other factors to take into account. And then does the fruit meet your needs? Are you looking at this for fresh consumption? Are you looking at something that would be really good for processing, or both? So those are some things to think about. One of the resources that I distributed and shared with Becky and Stephanie is this one right here. This is blueberry cultivars for the Pacific Northwest. They have a column in there that provides like a check to show that it's one that we recommend for a home gardener situation. I have a few caveats there, and I'm going to talk about that in the next slide, but Duke and Draper, I've mentioned these before. These are the ones that are the most widely grown in our region and at commercial levels, but they do have challenges. So if anyone tries to sell you Duke and Draper, I would advise against it because of what I mentioned, the calcium disorder for Draper, and then Duke can be a really great yielder but it has a very narrow set of conditions where it performs well. So it's a fickle variety, and that's why I don't recommend it for a home garden situation. So this is the table of the cultivars that I would recommend for a home gardener situation. It's not an exhaustive list, but I think this represents a list that kind of spans from early season production with Early Blue all the way through later season production with Jersey and Chandler. So I'm going to go through this slowly because I know this was one of the topics that was of interest, and just kind of point out some of the key points with each of these cultivars. So Early Blue, this is one of the earliest blooming varieties. It is a medium yielder, and that means, you know, from yield perspective. So, oh, I'm sorry, I found the chat box. I'm kind of surprised. Bad Michigan blueberry. Yes, Mike. I don't know where it came from, but that's, anyway, so a little distracting sometimes on the computer. So Early Blue, it has medium yield potential for a fruit size perspective, and I really tend to emphasize the fruit first when I list some of the characteristics, because that's oftentimes what home gardeners are interested in. Fruit size is medium to large. It has, I think, what I would consider some of the most aromatic flavor. It is an early producing variety, so it's going to be one of the first ones. It tends to be very vigorous, and it has a more, what we call erect or upright growth. And this is one that I really tend to like for early season production. Next, we have Spartan. So this is also from the Michigan breeding program, but this one tends to be a favorite among many. My research station, we have some Spartan and a lot of people enjoy it. Part of that is because it has really large fruit size, and the fruit tends to be, you know, kind of this nice classic sweet blueberry flavor. Bloom time is late, so in that case, if you're concerned about frost, it can also avoid it. But even though its bloom time is late, it tends to ripen rather earlier. So you're looking typically after Early Blue. It's pretty vigorous and also has more of an upright growth condition. It's another one, though, that if you have heavy soils that are prone to poor drainage, I wouldn't recommend it. It tends to perform poorly there, and maybe get even some root rot. Concentrated ripening, so this is one that it's going to produce enough that you can probably pick in 1 or 2 episodes. Patriot is one that it's not grown very widely commercially, but I like it for a home gardener perspective because it tends to be pretty adaptable in terms of its performance in a variety of soil types. Fruit can be pretty nicely sized if pruned accordingly. If you pick it earlier, it tends to be pretty high on the acids, and in general, it can be more of an acidic fruit. It also can have something called redback, where if you pick it really early, or if you are a little off on your pruning in the sense that maybe you're pruning not sufficiently, the back or the stem end of the fruit might not fully color, and it might turn more red. But it can also have concentrated ripening, so you can get through a few picks and have it be complete. The plant itself is fairly small, so you are a little limited on yield potential, but if you're looking at maybe a container garden even, this one is a good one. It does have some sensitivity, though, to phomopsis or bacterial blight. I love the fall foliage, excuse me. And then from a yield perspective, it's medium. Toro. Toro has also, it's another favorite at the research station and among a lot of home gardeners. Part of that is, again, the flavor and the size. It can have really large fruit size. It's, you know, kind of what I consider like a bull. Maybe that's how it got its name, Toro. I kind of consider it just like a really sturdy, stocky plant. It does seem to take a little longer to establish. Still 6 to 8 years you can get it to establish, but it's more on the 8 years and 6 years. Again, heavy soils that have high moisture content, I would tend to avoid it there because it is more sensitive to root rots. And then it has a very high to high yield potential. Then we have Olympia. Olympia I find the fruit size is pretty small, but it's also has some really nice flavor characteristics. These are also ones that you can pretty readily find in a garden or nursery. It's more of a spreading plant, so if you're planting Olympia, it might benefit from some trellising to keep those canes and laterals off the ground. And then the fruit size, the yield potential is about medium yield potential. Blue Crop. Blue Crop is another Michigan variety. It is more of the classic blueberry flavor. A lot of people love Blue Crop. It's probably one of my less favorite varieties, but it can be a good one. Fruit size can be large or medium, really variable based on pruning and crop load. So if you have a high crop load because of light pruning, it tends to produce a lot of smaller berries. And it can also tend to almost get into a biennial bearing habit. So it's just really sensitive to pruning and to crop load, which can make it a little tricky if you're looking for consistent yield. It also tends to be pretty sensitive to this redback issue where if you pick it too early or if you have the pruning off slightly, the back of the fruit can be red and not have that uniform blue coloration. It can be pretty vigorous. You can also have, Blue Crop's a little odd. You can have parts of the individual bush vigorous and parts not so vigorous. Again, a lot of that can be attributed to pruning. So it is a little bit more of a trickier one to prune. And again, medium to high yield potential. And then nearing the list here, Jersey. Jersey is, again, kind of like the traditional classic blueberry plant. A lot of people like Jersey because of the flavor. Size, this is going to be probably the smallest size berry that you'll find on this list or in general, but I think it has a really nice flavor. So that's why I have it on there. A lot of people like it too, because it's kind of one of the heirloom quote unquote varieties. It's one of the older and traditional ones. The plant itself, this one is going to be one of the largest plants. It's very tall and it can spread. And then it's, more spreading in terms of, if you don't have trellising. And then the yield potential tends to be medium, even though it's a large bush. So for that reason, it's not really liked commercially because you get big plants that are harder to pick and to prune for not a lot of yield, but it can be nice for a home gardener situation. And then last we have Chandler. This is kind of going to be rounding out your production window. This is going to be one where you can also get some large fruit. Flavor can be really phenomenal. It's not a concentrated ripening one, so you can have a lot of picks from Chandler because it will be slow to ripen. Plant size is more on the medium side. It also tends to have sensitivity to phomopsis or bacterial blight, and then it's got medium to high yield potential. So I see some questions. I want to see if I can access the chat box. If I see here. So, well, Northern, I'm going to just kind of go here too, because I don't want to miss some of these questions. Oh, go ahead and ignore the chat questions. Okay, I will ignore them, Becky.
Go ahead.
We're pretty casual. Okay, I'll answer these since we're on varieties, and I know this was an area of interest here. John Cornell asks, or states, I have about 30 Northern High Bush of about 7 different cultivars and 2 Rabbit Pink Luminades, which are outgrowing the Northern High Bush and don't set much fruit. Will the Northern High Bush cross-pollinate the Rabbit, or do I need other cultivars of Rabbit to do that? So for your Rabbit, I would highly recommend, if you want to get good fruit size and good fruit set, that you figure out what cultivars they are, and then we try to find out what is a good cross-pollinizer to pollinate that Rabbit. So you'd be looking for something where the pollen would pollinate your Rabbit blueberry, and then also the bloom would overlap with your Rabbit blueberry. Because in some cases, and I've seen this commercially here with people trying to grow Rabbit, they have two Rabbit cultivars. They should cross-pollinate, but one's blooming and the other one's not going to bloom in like 2 weeks. So they're going to miss each other from a pollination perspective. And your high bush, just to make sure that we understand, you really don't need a pollinizer. They will pollinate themselves. And then Becky asks, baking small fruit is nice and hence large varieties like Jersey are preferred. Absolutely. If you're going with baking, Jersey is a good one for that. or don't prune as much in some cases, because if you don't prune as much, you also tend to get smaller berry size, and we've seen that through research. And then Bob Baines asks, is Ivanhoe still a viable choice? So yes, Ivanhoe is still a viable choice. I just limited the list here a little bit. I know Ivanhoe can be another great one. I don't see that one as available, so it might be a little bit more tricky to find in the nurseries. But if you're looking, Rain Tree Nursery is one that tends to have some of the less well-known varieties that are circulated. So, okay. Kathy Haynes, I have a question from her too. This one's, she is, I have 2 very nice blueberry bushes that I don't have a name for. I'd like to buy duplicates. Can you help me identify? So this is a good question. I get it a lot. It's very hard to identify just by looking at the plant or the fruit. But you know, what you can do, Kathy, is you can note when there's a couple of things that can help out. You can note when your fruit is being produced. You can take pictures of your fruit. You can take pictures of the foliage. And then you can also take pictures of your flowers, because the flowers will vary quite a bit from cultivar. And all of these characteristics can be helpful. In addition, if you have any idea where you purchased your plants, that can also be helpful. So those are just some of the general things that can help identify it. But it's hard, especially this time of the year, to just identify it based on the look alone. Okay. And then Jamie Collar asked if I could comment on some of the other varieties like Darrow, Hardy Blue, and Blu-ray. Yeah, so Darrow, Hardy Blue, and Blu-ray, less familiarity with these, particularly Darrow. So let's see, Blueberry identifying gap would be cool, someone mentioned. It would be neat. I think it'd be a tough algorithm to crack though. Hardy Blue, so that's a good one. It tends to be a little bit earlier, a very, I would say, robust variety for the region, good fruit quality as well. Again, I would consider that one a little bit more of a robust variety. And then Blu-ray is another one. You know, I don't have any experience with Blu-ray, so I don't know about that one. So I'm sorry to say. And then another question that we have from Jim is, what are the difference between blueberries and huckleberries, and what limits the commercial potential of huckleberries? That's another great question. So the difference between blueberries and huckleberries. So first, huckleberries can mean many different species. There's red huckleberries, there's purple, there's just a lot right there as in terms of just huckleberries, and some of them aren't even in the same genus. So genetically speaking and botanically speaking, they're different at the genetic level, and as well as the physical characteristics, or the phenotype, as we would say. The commercial potential of huckleberries has been looked at by a lot of people. Our breeder, Chad Finn, our late breeder at Oregon State University, he unfortunately passed away in December. He tried to do work on huckleberries. We have another breeder at Washington State that's tried to pollinate, or excuse me, have crosses of huckleberry and blueberry. And Dan Burney at Idaho has also tried to commercially produce huckleberry. 2 challenges emerge. One is that they have very narrow soil requirements and conditions. It seems to be related to special symbioses they form with soil microorganisms. So it's been really hard to recreate those soil conditions at the biological level for huckleberry. That's one. And then the other is that they have low fruit set. So yield potential is lower for an individual huckleberry bush. And so then it becomes, from a commercial perspective, economy of scale issue, where even at a high value price for the fruit load on a per bush or per area basis tends to be low and detract a lot of growers or even breeders from wanting to try to continue that. So those are 2 of the reasons that's limited the potential for huckleberry. Okay. So are there similar issues research regarding service berries? So Chris asked about service berries. Service berries are actually related to more closely related to apple. They are in the rose family. Service berries can be great. There's not a huge amount of variety development on service berry, but they can be produced. Fruit load tends to be a little lower. You know, and I'm not directly that familiar with service berries. It kind of horticulturally tends to be more of a minor fruit crop, as well as an ornamental crop, but it's certainly a good one. Not a lot of market out there for it right now, which is, again, I think reflected in the research why we don't see it there. But it's one that you can grow pretty easily. It doesn't have a lot of the issues that I mentioned with huckleberry from just a production standpoint. It just is one that in the marketplace hasn't taken off and reached the same interest from like the research and the consumer basis as blueberry. So, and then Jamie Colliver, and I'm gonna say this will be the last variety question I answer just so that I can get to some of the other content, and I'll take more variety questions later. But did you say Duke was difficult to grow? And I did say Duke is difficult to grow. So Duke can perform very well and can be a very high yielder, but it's under a very narrow set of conditions. High peat, low soil moisture, you know, not completely dry, but doesn't tolerate very wet soil conditions. And pruning really needs to be on point or just right with Duke. So it's a great one, but it almost seems like it's a hit or miss in many cases with growers. So it's not, I would say, one that I would really recommend for a beginning grower. Okay. So I do encourage you to check out the guide that I sent though, because some of the varieties like Ivanhoe are listed there and you can learn more about it. This is just kind of the top ones that I have experience with, ones that I see in the nursery and ones that I think would be good for a home gardener situation. Okay. And then here, another reason I selected these is because they do represent a fairly large window of production. And just to kind of give you a sense, the ones that I mentioned that are on this figure here are highlighted with a red asterisk. So these bars here represent kind of the timing of fruit production and harvest. And so you can see you have the potential, this is for Oregon, so you have to shift this to more late June, but you have the potential to stretch all the way through late September into early October to get fruit production. The ones on the lower end here, these three are rabbit eye blueberries, so they add to your window of production later, more so than the high bush blueberries. And then we have some also like Elliott and Aurora. These are northern high bush blueberries. You can grow them here. They tend to be more acidic, and they do offer that late season production, but they're also options on ones that are grown commercially and can be grown here pretty well as well. Okay, so I'm going to talk about plant growth and development because, you know, I think to inform our management, it's good to have a sense of what's occurring physiologically with the plant. And it's also good as we communicate about blueberry that we're communicating about the right structures. And so these are the main structures of the plant. So crown, that's a familiar term. This is the perennial part of the plant where roots and canes emerge, and it's at the ground level. It's represented by this arrow here. And emerging from the crown, you have the roots and the base, and then you have these canes. These are, we call them primary stems. They're typically 3 years or older, and they have bark on them that's pretty visible and exfoliates. And then these canes give rise to 2 main shoot types that you can find on them. And we'll talk about what those shoot types are. But the other thing I like to mention with blueberry, which makes it pretty unique for a fruit crop, is that growth occurs in flushes. So it's not this continuous curve of growth, so to speak. You'll have growth from these shoots in one season for a few weeks and it'll stop. And we get something called black tip where that growing tip aborts, and then you'll have a secondary bud eventually break beneath that growing bud and grow from it and kind of have a second flush. And you can have that cycle multiple times in a given season. And it kind of gives rise to the shape of a blueberry bush. There'll be a figure a little bit later on that I hope will kind of help you see what I mean by flushes and having multiple flushes of growth in a season. Now with the shoot types, we have two main shoot types. We have lateral, so these are the 1-year-old woods that you'll see here that produce the fruiting buds, and it's the 1 or 2-year-old laterals that tend to be the most productive in terms of forming fruiting buds and producing fruit. So then the other structure of shoots are whips. These are thin, they're unbranched, they tend to emerge later than the lateral shoots, and they can come from the base of the plant or latent buds on the crown or higher up on these older canes. And these, I almost kind of think about them as renewal, so that, you know, as your plant gets older and as canes age and they're really kind of losing their productivity, these whips coming from the base of the plant, they can be used to kind of replace canes that you remove over the life of your plant. There's also buds that's important to know. There's two types of buds with blueberry. We have our fruiting buds, as the name implies, those provide the fruit and the flowers. And then the figure here on the left just shows where they're placed. They're on the tip of our laterals here, and they are larger and they're rounder. You can also see them here in my hand. And they generally start to break before, for most varieties, the vegetative buds. And the vegetatives are smaller, they are producing leaves. Those leaves and those shoots really are important for fueling and providing the energy and resources for fruit development on these fruiting buds. So they're really important to retain and protect. And then when these buds form is actually in kind of midsummer, when fruit are starting to develop or being harvested, and into fall as a response to changes in day length and moisture and temperature. And I like to mention that because sometimes after we pick our fruit, maybe it's just me, can unfortunately forget that the plant is still forming its buds for next year. So maybe we might be remiss and forget to irrigate our blueberry plants. Try not to do that, because that is going to potentially be limiting your fruit bud development and your potential for the next year. And then roots, I really like blueberry roots. They're really interesting, and they're important to understand too from a nutrient perspective. So blueberry is shallow rooted, as I mentioned. Most of those roots are in the first 18 inches of soil, and they do not spread very far from that crown area. Most of them are within a foot, as you can kind of see by this figure here. As I mentioned, they don't have root hairs. And they're very, very, very fine rooted, about the diameter of a human hair. And they form those associations with fungal mycorrhizae. Interestingly too, you know, those mycorrhizae seem to come naturally in the soil or in the air. You don't need to add them to your soil. The plant is already adept at forming those symbioses. But we do tend to see is that if in high nitrogen fertilizer situations, those mycorrhizae tend to not form. And it's probably kind of like a decision the plant makes, because those mycorrhizae tend to get nutrients from the plant in exchange for helping with nutrient like nitrogen and water acquisition and phosphorus acquisition. But if there's plenty of nutrients, the plants seem to not form those types of associations. But you know, if you're ever looking at biological amendments and adding mycorrhizae for your blueberry, it's something I wouldn't recommend, to be quite honest, because the blueberry is already adept at forming them on its own. And then thicker roots that you might find in the plant, those are just important for, you know, really anchoring that plant in the ground and storage of materials for, you know, over winter to fuel early growth. This is the figure I mentioned. I love this figure because it kind of just shows us what's happening in terms of root and shoot growth over the course of a season. And what I wanted to point out is first the flushes. So if you look at the green dots here and the lines connecting them, you'll see these increases, and there's about 3 actually peaks where we have peaks in shoot growth. Those represent the flushes of growth that I was talking about, where we have a surge of vegetative shoot growth, and it stops and it declines, and then we have another surge, it stops and declines, and another surge. And notice where it starts to decline is right around when fruit are developing, and that's because where a lot of resources are going is to developing those fruit. And then it shifts and starts growing again, as do the roots, around the harvest time, because all of a sudden that fruit load, that resource intensive fruit is being removed from the plant, so the plant can reallocate nutrients and resources to growing more shoots, to kind of rebuild itself in preparation for winter and roots. The reason I think it's also important to look at what's happening with the roots is because when you're having active root growth, like in the spring and in the fall, those are times that are ideal for applying nutrients, because the plants are physically more able to take up those nutrients. And we recommend spring nutrient applications, so right around this window, because the likelihood of losing those nutrients to leaching is much less, as opposed to if you apply in the fall. But there's certainly some nutrients like phosphorus that you can apply later on. Pollination, just spend a few minutes on that. We've talked a little bit about pollinizers. So we kind of covered this already, but I do want to emphasize that blueberry does benefit from pollinators in the landscape, and native wild pollinators like bumblebees or mason bees and wild bees are really excellent at pollinating blueberries. Honeybees can pollinate blueberries. They're used commercially, but they tend not to forage as well as, say, bumblebees under, say, diverse climatic conditions like rain and cold periods. So to get good pollination and to get good fruit development, it's important to ensure or try to get pollinators in your landscape. And so, you certainly can try to utilize honeybees if you already have them, but there are some limitations, as I mentioned earlier. Basically, if your temperatures are 55 degrees Fahrenheit or below, honeybee is really not going to be foraging and subsequently not pollinating your plants very well. So they're challenging in that regard. And we do see in some of our research that if we are achieving good pollination and we have good weather for honeybee pollination, our yields and our size of our fruit tends to be a lot greater. From a home gardener perspective, I think the best thing that you can do is to encourage natives in your landscape, try to encourage having pollinator habitat. So plants that are providing good foraging for wild bees in your landscape, particularly bumblebees, because those can really provide excellent pollination for your blueberry plants. And then the fruit itself is a berry. So it's a single flower and a fruit developing from that single flower, a single carpel if you have botany in the back of your brain. The fruit produces this bloom. So it's this waxy white powder on it. And this is produced naturally through fruit development. It's believed to help reduce moisture loss and keep moisture in the fruit, and maybe provide some UV protection along with the darker anthocyanins. And it is nice to keep that bloom from a commercial perspective. We try to, when we pick it, maintain it, and fruit tends to store longer when we have that bloom on there. So what that means is when you're picking, try not to be too rough. You don't want to bruise them, but you also don't want to lose that bloom because it can help with storage. The fruit itself, it can develop anywhere from 2 to 3 months after pollination. That really depends on the variety, or cultivar that you're growing, but it also depends on the weather conditions, because weather can really push or delay that ripening period. So when it comes to berry development, we want to make sure that we're providing good irrigation. I would say throughout, we don't want to saturate our plants, but we want to make sure that water is not limiting, so that we can get good filling in our fruit. And then also we have the ability to produce optimal size and optimal flavor. And interestingly, those flavor compounds, those aromatic compounds, are concentrated in the skin. And if you've eaten a lot of different blueberries, you would know that there's quite a diversity in flavor of blueberry as well. And then if we're looking at bushes, on average, we say a mature blueberry bush can produce about 20 pounds of fruit. There is a lot of variation associated with that as well, though, because it depends on how big your bush is, as well as management practices. So Hardy Blue and Patriot, some of these that tend to be smaller, you might be looking at a smaller yield, maybe 15 pounds as opposed to 20 pounds. And then some of the larger bushes, you might be getting more, but ballpark it's about 20 pounds. Then development of fruit quality. I think this is just the physiologist in me that's interested in fruit quality. So We look at berries, there's 3 stages of berry development. We have stage 1 where we have cell division, and we're basically developing as many cells as possible. And the more cells that that berry has, the more that later on you can expand those cells through addition of water basically in those cells and get larger fruit. So that first stage, ensuring that no nutrients or water is not limiting, is really important for ensuring you have high size potential through cells development. Then we have this lag phase. This lag phase is really interesting. This is where the seeds and the embryo are developing. So the fruit's green, we're not seeing a big change in volume or diameter or weight of the berries, but the seeds internally are maturing. And then we get in stage 3, this uptick of growth where we start having color change, softening of the berries, the same term that we use in the wine and grape world, veraison, is occurring where we're having that color and softening change. And then if we let those fruit continue to hang, it's towards the later parts of berry development that we get those flavor compounds really forming. But we want to make sure that we aren't picking our fruit too late, because the fruit can start to soften as it hangs for a long time on the bush. And that softness can be unfavorable for storage and for eating quality. But if you look at the right, what's also happening internally in the berry as you are past that veraison stage, again, that's where you're starting to get color change in the berry and softening, your acids start to drop and your sugars start to rise. And there's several points along that chain where you can get really good flavor from just that sugar to acid ratio. So when you're picking, and you're unfamiliar with your fruit, I really encourage you to go out there after color change and just taste every once in a while and see how the firmness is, see how the flavor compounds are, see what that acid and sugar ratio is like. And you'll learn just by simply tasting on the bush and among different varieties that are cultivars that you have, the flavor profile, and start to hone down on a good harvest time. Okay, so nutrient management. Nutrient management is a really interesting part of Blueberry. It is such a unique system. Just as overview, the goal when we're talking about fertilization is to make sure that nothing is limiting or nothing in excess, so that the plant can grow adequately without any types of issues with deficiency or toxicity from too much nutrients. We consider a nutrient essential if it's needed for proper growth and development and for us to be producing high quality fruit. And then we have macronutrients, which include like nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium. Those we can generally provide through soil amendments. And then we have micronutrients. They're needed in much smaller quantities, but are still equally important. And they also can be provided in the soil if they're lacking. But some of them, like boron, you can actually apply through foliar feeding. Iron is another example where you can apply adequately by foliar applications, if you're so inclined. So nutrient management, it's like with any of the fruit crops that you're growing, it's really essential to have a good nutrient management program for high production and good production of quality fruit. What's unique about blueberries, and as I've mentioned previously, is that they're adapted to low pH or acidic soil conditions, with our target pH range being anywhere from around 4.5 to 5.5. In Western Washington, we're pretty fortunate that our environment, we tend to already have fairly acidic soil conditions because of our winter rains. They tend to naturally leach cations from our soil that tend to be basic and contribute to alkalinity. But that being said, if you're looking at blueberries, it's good to take a soil test and determine your pH range, and if you need to do anything to modify your soil pH so that you're more in a target range. Because if you're not in that target pH range, then your plant's going to have challenges taking up the nutrients it needs. And I'll talk about pH modification later on. The other interesting thing is that most plants use and take up nitrate forms of nitrogen. Blueberry is unique in that it takes up the ammonium form of nitrogen. The ammonium form, or NH4, tends to be favored at low pH conditions. So If you have low pH soil conditions, you're already doing a favor in terms of nitrogen by keeping that form that's most available there. It will naturally convert to nitrate, but you're doing yourself much better in terms of nitrogen by having a good pH range. Blueberry also likes high soil organic matter content. General rule of thumb is around 4% or greater, but you can, with adapted varieties, also be able to grow them at lower pH, or excuse me, lower organic matter as well. And there's ways you can add organic matter to your soil, and I'll talk about that later. This is kind of an overview slide, so I'll go into more detail. One thing that many people are not aware of, and they do this out of good effort and good conscience, but they add amendments that are high in salt and pH, like manures or compost. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but those types of amendments, we have to approach them really carefully if we're going to be using them. And in some cases, I would recommend not even using compost or manures at all, particularly from animal origins, because of high salt and pH issues, which can be problematic for blueberry. So just some other pre-plant considerations. I've spoken about the soil aspect, but you also want to make sure that you're thinking about water drainage in your site, particularly as you're matching up varieties, air drainage, just so that you're having good air movement. If it's stagnant air, we can have disease start to build up because we're not having good circulation. And then if irrigation is important, we also have to think about what type of water that we have and our ability to irrigate. And the water quality, it's something I just want to make sure you're aware of. In general, in the western part of the state, we tend to have good water quality for irrigating our blueberry plants. It's in situations where our water might be alkaline or have a lot of carbonates in it that we can start to see issues with blueberry, because those carbonates can change the pH of the soil and be disadvantageous for blueberries, where we want to be keeping our soil conditions acidic. So you can do a water quality test to see what your irrigation water is like. But in general, water quality tends to be good on this side of the state. So you'll have these resources if you're interested in doing a soil test. These are kind of the recommended ranges to be in. Also, the pH is listed here again, 4.2 to 5.5. Also, if you're looking at land that's been previously managed with dairy, be aware of the EC content. You're looking at EC being salts. You want a relatively low level. If you have an area that's got a history of dairy or animal production and there's been excretions, you can have problems with high salt content, which can be problematic for blueberry because it's sensitive to high salts. Okay, so there was questions also about amendments to add to blueberry, and I'm trying to spend enough time here so I can address that. Oftentimes in the traditional approach to growing blueberry is to add Douglas fir sawdust mulch. That can be beneficial by increasing organic matter, and it'll also kind of break down in your soil and provide continued release of some nutrients. So I mentioned you want to avoid animal-based manures, cedar, oak, and walnut, which can have some compounds in it that can be a little phytotoxic for blueberry, or treated sawdust. And then when you're talking about application, we're looking at about, pre-plant 3.5 inches in 3-foot wide strips on 10-foot centers. That's kind of we're typically looking at commercially, and that's about 19 units an acre if you're scaling up. And then with that, we're generally recommending that you add about 5 pounds of nitrogen per unit, because sawdust tends to has a high carbon to nitrogen ratio. So what that means is that when you apply sawdust, that carbon will stimulate soil microorganisms in your soil to grow. They will use nitrogen in your soil, and they will outcompete it with blueberry as they grow and need those resources as well. So if you're using sawdust, you want to be able to apply additional nitrogen so that that microbial tie-up that happens when you apply sawdust, it can be mitigated and not outcompete your plants later on because you're providing extra. And then you can incorporate that to about 10 inches into your soil. And there's also, it also depends on the age of your sawdust. So fresh sawdust as opposed to aged sawdust. The fresh sawdust is going to have a higher ratio of carbon to nitrogen, so it's going to tie up nitrogen more and make it more limiting to your plant. So when you have the ability, try to go for the more aged sawdust, because it's going to be tying up nitrogen or less. Okay, now acidifying soils. When it comes to soil acidification, if you need to do it, elemental sulfur is going to be your ally. I don't like giving a straight up application rate because it really varies based on your soil conditions. So what is your pH that you're starting at? What is your cation exchange capacity and your buffering capacity? These basically are variables that a soil test lab can help you interpret, but it tells you how resistant your soil may be to changes in pH. And if it's very resistant, you're going to need more sulfur than if it's less resistant. It's also something that is a biologically mediated process, so it takes time, essentially. When you apply that sulfur, it's not going to be a quick fix in terms of changing your soil pH. It can take up to a year for that sulfur to be acted upon by soil microbes and lower your pH to the target range. As I mentioned too, prior to planting is a good time to add organic matter if it's limiting. And then I pointed this out here, it's not really a situation that we have here in Western Washington, but if you have high carbonate or high pH water, there are commercial operations that actually acidify their irrigation water post-plant, so that in addition to the pre-plant pH lowering techniques, they have post-plant through acidified irrigation water. And there's resources that can help guide acidification because it is really a science. And so this is the resource that I mentioned. I didn't share this specific document with the group, but it is available free on the web. And if you have any issues accessing it, just email me. Okay. So we're kind of running a little low on time. I didn't expect so many great questions. So I'm gonna go a little bit longer and just, I'll stop at 8:30 and answer some questions. I'll answer questions and see if you want to go on or have me stop. But nitrogen fertility, as I mentioned, blueberries adapted to utilizing ammonium. So you want ammonium or ammonium forming fertilizers. And this is something that you can gather from the nutrient analysis of a fertilizer that you might purchase. The other option too is if you're in a home gardener situation, any type of organic material like fish emulsion, bone meal, blood meal, just again, staying away from manure-based products, those will have that ammonium form of nitrogen already in it. If you're short on nitrogen, you will start seeing symptoms of deficiency like just poor growth and yellowing of the plant and reddening, but you also don't want to apply too much. And part of that is because you can have some issues with high salt associated with too much. You can cause excessive vegetative growth at the expense of fruit growth. And then sometimes fertilizers with nitrogen can have high salts when applied in high concentration. So it's good to apply within the recommended ranges. So here's a picture. I actually took this picture about a week ago of a field. It was a former field that was in dairy production, and the grower didn't realize some of the problems that dairy manure can have because of high salt and pH. And the high pH basically made the nitrogen not available in the soil because it was in the wrong form. And so we saw some of these classic symptoms of nutrient deficiency, but also iron deficiency because the iron was not available to the plant at that high pH. So applying nitrogen, if you remember that graph I showed you where we saw the uptick in root growth in the spring, that's occurring around the bloom time. So when you start to have bloom, that is a really good time to start applying your fertilizers because your roots are actively growing. Generally, it's good to apply them in small amounts. So I recommend taking the total amount that you would like to apply based on the age of your plants and your production goals and dividing it into thirds. So you have 1/3 applied kind of late April, early May when you have the bloom coming, then again mid-May to late May, and then mid-June. In addition, if you are really set up and you want to apply liquid fertilizers, you can certainly fertigate. Again, you want to start applying right around bloom, 5 to 10% of that bloom being there, and continue through harvest. And if you want to be, again, this is what commercial operations will often do. They'll apply their nitrogen every week to 2 weeks and get it there to make sure that's available to their plants. And they will do this through these irrigation lines and have it injected in their irrigation water. And you want to make sure that if you're going with this approach, applying it underneath the mulch so it can have good access to your soil and then close to your plants, because again, blueberry has a very shallow and small root system. So you don't want to make sure, you want to make sure that you're not applying it outside of the root zone for blueberry. And just a few other examples. So again, this is again a commercial field from my colleague and partner Dave Ryla. You can see we've got 2 drip lines on either side of these bushes that is placed before the sawdust mulch, again to ensure that it's getting close to the root zone. And then we also have it on both sides because blueberry doesn't translocate nutrients very readily around the plant. So 2 lines helps ensure that it's available and both sides can have good access to it. Okay, so it's 8:28. I stopped. I'm just going to take a pause here. And Becky, I'm just going to turn to you. I answered a lot of questions earlier, so I got a little off track time-wise. Would you like me to keep going, or would you like me to take questions? I'm happy to do either.
I think if you can actually keep going, that would be my preference. I think we'd love to hear the rest of it. And by all means, people, if you have questions, go ahead and be typing them in. That will give us an idea of how long some of the questions will take. But I guarantee you there will be questions, but go ahead and keep going. So
Great.
How much longer do you think you have?
Not very much longer. What I'll do is I'll just go briefly over the diseases. And a lot of these things I will just point out as a resource.
I think that there will probably be a lot of questions that come up about diseases too. So
okay, great.
Thank you.
Well, what I might do then is, again, I'll spend a little bit less time. The interesting thing is I gave this lecture very similar to my students today because we were talking about blueberry. So, and I'm able to get through this content in less time, but we have some good questions. And so if you do have to step out, not at all insulted, I understand about people's time constraints, but. So what we're looking here on this slide is, again, this is more for commercial settings, but I want to provide it so that if you're interested in rates, both in a situation where you're applying your fertilizer through your drip system with just fertigation, or if you're looking at dry fertilizers, whether synthetic or organic, you can see how to apply different rates based on the age of your plant. And we apply more or less based on age because the size differs and their requirements for nitrogen differ as well. And then this slide just really hits home the fact that I hope none of you have to experience, but animal-based manures and compost, I've seen so many issues where people apply these, and again, these types of materials have high salt, which we can measure through EC and high pH, and they can be really problematic for blueberry unless it's acidified. So this is one reason why you want to be careful with the amendments that you apply. And if you're looking at it, ask a test or just avoid the animal-based products altogether and look at things like peat or sawdust. Those, as you see on this table, have low electrical conductivity, low pH as well, and they're suitable for blueberry as a result of that. And then we do research on organic nutrients for blueberry. And this slide is not meant to promote any of these products, but just share that we have done this type of research looking at organic nitrogen sources for blueberry. And these are products that we have seen work very well for blueberry, both in our trials as well as other trials in Oregon. So again, not meant to promote them, but they are sources available that work well. And then the other thing too, if you're looking at meal-based products, like a bone meal or a feather meal, you want to look at applying that about 2 weeks earlier than what I mentioned on the previous slides, because those take a while to basically mineralize in the soil and make that ammonium nitrogen available. And then mulching, because blueberry is shallow rooted, it really does benefit from mulching, not just for weed suppression and moisture retention, but just to provide a nice temperature also for that root growth. So looking at sawdust, it's around 2 to 3 inches of sawdust mulch around the plants. Make sure that you're not burying the crown or suffocating the crown, because you can have some problems as a result of that. Douglas fir sawdust mulch is a classic type of mulch material that we can use. It's widely available in our region. Aged material is better because of that nitrogen tie-up. You can also use untreated orchard wood chips. That's very common in Eastern Washington. And then weed fabric. So those might be like your landscape fabric, your woven polyethylene or polypropylene fabrics. Those also can do quite well. I would recommend adding a little bit extra or making sure you have adequate organic matter in those situations as well, just because you're not tending to provide that extra material when you have those weed fabrics, and they last for a long time. And then diseases. So this is where I'm starting to wrap up. So I really like to encourage people to make sure that they're looking at the Pacific Northwest Disease Handbook, or make sure it's on their radar. This is updated every year. Maybe 2020 might be the exception with COVID, but otherwise it's updated every year. And it has a really good resource on different types of diseases and pests for different types of crops, including blueberry. So I'm going to mention some of the key blueberry diseases that we have in our region. The first being mummyberry. This is really problematic for organic growers because they don't necessarily have a lot of the tools that help with effective mummyberry management. So with mummyberry, we have two phases of infection, and you'll see that on the subsequent slide. The first infection can be from overwintering mummies, which is a type of reproductive structure that this fungus disease produces. And those produce a special type of spore called ascospores that infect the foliage. And then once the foliage is infected, they produce another type of spore called conidia, and that leads to the secondary infection phase where we can have our flowers and fruit infected. So with this, and you'll see the disease cycle, it's pretty interesting, but the important thing to remember is the two infection stages, the primary infection and the secondary infection, because those are really going to offer the most opportunity for management if you have mummyberry. So with primary infection, what you can do is simply remove the mummies. We have seen many organic operations do that effectively, where they say if you find any, I remember one operation that cleaned up a mummyberry problem by just telling people to find, if they paid them essentially. If they found any mummies and they filled up a cup, they paid them extra money. And they pretty much eradicated a huge mummyberry problem in the course of a few years organically and with those cultural approaches. You can also try to disrupt mummyberry formation or the spore formation here at this stage through heavy mulching, also by raking or tilling, which disrupts the spores. That can be somewhat effective. And then the other thing that you can do, and this is more widely applied in commercial settings that are conventional, but you can apply fungicides. So there's several fungicides, organic and conventional, that you can apply during the primary infection stage and then during the secondary infection stage. And again, the reason I share this with you is that I want you to understand that if you're dealing with mummyberry and you're looking at fungicides, you're going to want to be looking at applying them when you have ascospores and they're colonizing young leaves and buds that are breaking. So the stage of your plants all the way through flowering. So it's usually a pretty regimented and rigorous approach when you're looking at fungicides, particularly for organic because they don't have the persistence to stay on the foliage, but it can be managed. The other one is bacterial blight or twig blight. That's Phomopsis. So this one is, this can be a problem. It can overwinter on infected plant material. And it is one that is, I think, best controlled through good horticultural management. So one would be, and again, I should discuss the symptomology a little bit more. So it can cause this dieback of the canes when you have the infection of this pathogen. And it can also form these types of cankers near the base of infected canes. I don't have any good pictures of the cankers. And in severe situations, it can cause some rot. How to manage it? First, just prune out some of this infected disease. So if you have infected tissue, pruning it several inches below the canker or infection site and getting rid of that infected material and disposing it is one approach. The other is avoiding injury. So oftentimes this pathogen can enter plants because of wounds that happen when the plant's still growing, or through plants that are not hardy and having injuries due to hardiness issues in the late summer and fall. So having adapted varieties. And then the other way to do management is through fungicides, such as copper-based fungicides. And then blueberry shock virus. So as I was listening to some of the earlier discussion, it sounded like there was someone who was dealing with speckling on their blueberries. They thought it was maybe a fungal disease. It could also be shock. Blueberry shock virus is very common. It's not a deadly disease by any means. So it's a pollen-borne virus. It infects the plants. Some show the symptoms worse than others in terms of cultivar susceptibility. But what happens is you can start getting, in some cases, this kind of speckling or coloration on the leaves. You'll have thin leaf production, or you might have very little leaf production, and the bush might look something like this in severe cases. And your plant might remain like that for a year or maybe up to 3 years, but eventually it will grow out of it, and then it'll carry that virus for its remaining life. And what happens with shock virus is it's a kind of something we just tend to deal with, kind of like the flu. It just passes through our planting, and eventually it passes through once the planting is aged enough. There's not a lot you can do to control it. It's pollen-borne, so your pollinators that you need are carrying it if there's any in your area, and it's not deadly to your plants. Okay, with pruning, I just will point out there's this video. This is a free available video. If you want more information about pruning, Oregon State University and my colleague, Dr. Bernadine Strick, does provide on-demand pruning classes through Oregon State University. And I'll show that a little bit later because some of you might have interest in it. And she has some really good footage for pruning. And then propagation. I knew I didn't have enough time to go into this, and it's not my expertise, but some of the thoughts that I have is that most growers do buy their own nursery plants because they're clean material, and propagation can take a lot of time, and it can be fairly difficult for blueberry. Seed propagation, it's something you can do. However, your plants won't be true to that variety that it came from. It's going to be different, like many fruit crops, like apple, if you were to grow apple. But you can vegetatively propagate through hard or softwood cuttings, and I say for non-protected cultivars. So cultivars that are older than 20 years in its release and they're no longer protected through patents. Other types of propagation, you can do tissue culture. If you have a tissue culture lab, that's how a lot of nurseries will start regenerating plants. And something I would recommend for the home gardener, but just so that you know. And you can also take suckers, or actually technically whips, and propagate them. If you're looking at this, again, there's a guide that I provided by some of my colleagues, Kluwer and Klein. Make sure your mother plant is healthy, free of viruses and diseases. It's really important that you pay attention to the right media and that your propagules are having good moisture and aeration. So that's what I wanted to say about that, and enjoy those resources. And with that, I just wanted to thank you for your attention. I know this ran long, but I didn't want to stop and not answer some of those questions about varieties. And again, feel free to check out the website for some of these